Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Stoltenberg, for this overview that you have illustrated, mentioning the problems as well. And by looking at this horizon, we feel that there is a great awareness of the historical values and the current values for which this organization, one of the biggest organizations in the world, is continuing its effort. Now we have just a few minutes, as I would like to add some thoughts. So I would like to go back to Minister Alfano, who emphasized very much the issue of religious freedom. In the current situation, over 75% of the world population, we have many friends who come to the meeting here and study the condition of religious freedom in the world. So over 75% of the world population live in conditions in which religious freedom is not assured. Or in many cases, there's even persecution, or they are prohibited to worship their faith. So what can we do to change this? And this figure is actually getting worse, because some years ago statistics mentioned 75%, and today our friend Braham Green, who will present tomorrow here and tomorrow, we are at 79%. Of course, there's huge differences in many different settings, but it is really a worrying piece of information. So religious freedom is one of the central issues in the current debate. What do you think? Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, there is one first idea that I have when I go to the Mass. I think that many of you go to the Mass, and sometimes we listen to the readings during the liturgy telling us about the difficulties of the first Christian communities. And then we have historical knowledge of persecution of the very first Christian communities. And also we think that we have studied history in books, or that we have listened to the readings. Well, no. It is as if we were reading some news of current affairs. This is incredible. That is, persecutions due to religion are really very common. And on top of this, some years ago, the Church, dear Secretary General of the NATO, considered a priest, Father Pino Pugliese, and this priest was considered by the Church because he was killed for being a priest. He was killed for preaching his Christian values by the mafia in Palermo, and he was proclaimed saint. So persecution is not just about what we can think of persecution of Christian communities abroad. It is something that it is inside those people who believe that the religious freedom is a kind of aggression and a kind of attack against certain interests. Now, going back to the general subject, I come from Sicily, and my origin also makes me think about this idea of persecutions against the Christians. Well, some weeks ago, in collaboration with the Vatican, I started an observatory at the Foreign Affairs Ministry, and I set up this observatory on religious minorities. Until now, I have talked about Christian communities, but we know that religious persecutions are not just against the Christians. We know that religious minorities is a fundamental issue in modern freedom. So what did I want to do? I wanted to set up this observatory. There are members that are experts to try and start an Italian automatic kind of early warning process that could let us in the foreign ministry have information from all over the world in real time about individual cases or more general cases of religious persecutions or attacks against religious freedom. All of this is going to be developed by means of a system that will be based on our diplomatic channels, and the aims that we have is to give an Italian contribution to this. Now, foreign policy in Italy. Well, I am the 37th foreign ministry in Italy, but this doesn't mean that the policy in Italy, foreign policy in Italy, have changed for 37 times. There are some pillars, the pillar of the transatlantic alliance, the NATO, the faith in integration, European integration, and there's also the pillar of the Mediterranean view, and there is another pillar that is about the defense of human rights. Within this defense, I think that the issue of religious freedom and religious communities is fundamental. It is fundamental because it refers to the basis of individuals' liberty to worship his or her own God. And it really refers to a natural element that is called natural right. We have all been educated to respect the positive right, that is the right that is given to the society and regulated by different legal systems, but we also have a kind of natural right that comes before the positive right. So this is what we have to do. We have to work on this to remind all the world and in every circumstances that as Italians we have an important role in our foreign policy to protect human rights. And so one of the fundamental rights is the right to worship. Everybody should have the right to worship his or her own God, and everybody should have the right to worship their God in their country and to respect the rules in the country where they live. In the system of international cooperation, we have the right and the power to a certain extent to take action to defend religious freedom. And let's remember this too, that the more we can defend religious freedom, the more the world will be secure and safe. I was talking earlier to the Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Stoltenberg, that at the meeting in Rimini, we refer to people even beyond their role, even if they have very important roles. So we always ask questions about individuals' experiences. So I wanted to ask you this question. You have such an important role. How do you feel in such a role with a high responsibility, which means that you should contribute to protect the destiny of the world and make it a safer place? Do you take a lot of sleeping pills? Can you sleep at night? Do you wake up happy in the morning?
I am very good at sleeping. I sleep in my bed, but I also sleep in the plane, I sleep in cars, so I know how to sleep. And I think that's a big advantage if you are working in NATO. But perhaps even more important is that I am very humbled by being at the helm of NATO. Because that's a very meaningful job. because my main task is to every day try to help to contribute to peace. And of course I don't do that alone. NATO is an alliance of 29 different nations. We protect almost 1 billion citizens in NATO countries. And of course I have an excellent staff, people helping me every day. So I sleep and I wake up happy, knowing that we have been successful in the most important task for NATO, and that is to prevent war and preserve peace for the people living in NATO countries. And since NATO was established almost 70 years ago, we have had one of the longest periods of peace in our part of Europe. Then, of course, there are many challenges, and I mentioned many of them in my speech. The threat of terrorist attacks, instability in our neighborhood, North Africa, Middle East, Afghanistan, and so on. And we have to address that, and I work on how to address that. But I am happy, and I am confident that NATO will be able to preserve the peace for NATO allies also in the future, because we have been able to adapt and change every time the world is changing. And the last thing I will say about this is that I'm also happy because one of the great advantages of being Secretary General of NATO is that I'm invited to so many places. I meet so many nice people. For instance, I'm invited to Rimini and meet all of you. Thank you.
Right, we have just a few minutes. I had many more questions, but I will just ask one more question. Back to Minister Alfano, I wanted to ask you a question about Russia. And we see that there is a NATO view on this respect, and there is also an Italian view in the relations with Russia. What are you working on at present? What is the country doing, Italy doing, to decrease this kind of tension and perhaps reaching a new negotiation stage with less tension? Well, thank you for this question. You have asked a kind of personal question to Secretary General of NATO, but I thought that here in this room there is a friend with us, and I'm sure that you know this person very well. And this person really plays a very important role at NATO because he's the president of the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO. He's an Italian gentleman. Italy didn't have this role for many years. It is the first time now that Italy is again in charge of this role, uniting all the parliamentary delegations of the countries of the alliance, creating a kind of parliament. And I'm talking about Mr. Paolo Valli, whom you know very well. And his role is really, really important. And I believe this is one of the most important roles fulfilled by Italian representatives at an international level. Now back to the question. I believe that as far as relations with Russia are concerned, we do play an interesting role. Our country is very close to the transatlantic dimension. We have relations with the United States of America, and a fundamental element of our policy there is part of our presence in NATO, because our identity is even more visible and strong. And in 2017, we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Alcide de Gasperi's trip to Washington, from which this transatlantic relation was established and through which the plan for development of Europe was started, specifically the development of our country. However, we are a Mediterranean country, and we never had a view of narrow-mindedness, and we didn't want to close our view. During the Cold War, there was a big issue for energy supply. The Second World War had ended, but the Cold War was still there. At that time, we were facing the issue of how to warm Italian people's houses and how to supply energy to our country through gas pipes. During the Cold War, Italy had no worries, no preoccupations to establish commercial relations, trade relations with Russia to warm Italian people's houses with the gas coming from the Soviet Union. And for the Soviet Union, Italy turned into a very reliable client, and for us, they became very reliable energy suppliers. What is the situation now? Now we have a problem. That is, we have problems relating to Crimea, to Ukraine. How did we react? We have been loyal to the system of sanctions that a big part of the international community decided to adopt. We have been loyal to the sanctions. We complied with Europe and the international community, and we also had to bear all the consequences of these sanctions, because many international suppliers had to be replaced. But still, we defended the ideas of liberty in Crimea, and also we addressed the question of an aggression that we consider to be outside the rules of international relations. However, at the same time, we also support the idea that there should be no automatic renewal of sanctions, and that sanctions are not really the end, they are the means to go back to the rule of law at an international level in a situation where things went wrong. So that's the situation in which we are trying to insist in applying the Minsk agreement that were signed to implement a long-lasting peace and to retrieve security and the rule of law in that area. And with these agreements, when these agreements are complied, we will be the first in saying that the sanctions can be lifted. But still, we had a very strong trade relations, and just like Germany and other countries did, we have these relations with Russia because it's our partner. What I can say about this is, first of all, that what we have done in terms of sanctions didn't lead Russia to have a negative reaction towards us, just excluding our country, because the Russian government has just entrusted an Italian company with a contract that is more than 4 billion euros. It is nearly 4 billion euros. On the other hand, we shouldn't forget something in the partnership between NATO and Russia. In Pratica di Mare, an agreement was reached to create the NATO-Russia Council. I think that the Pratica di Mare event has been one of the most important heritage of the Berlusconi's government, because that event that established the NATO-Russia Council started a way of having a dialogue that will function regardless of the contingent situation. So even in turbulent times, dialogue will be available there. And then, secondly, to conclude, we should not forget that Russia is part of a global alliance against international terrorism. And the sense of this participation should never be underestimated, because Russia is part of that alliance against terrorism. So trying to strike a balance in this situation is really important. I know that sometimes strong reactions may be the first reaction that comes at our availability, but good sense is also important. Now, just a few seconds to go back to Mr. Stoltenberg and close our session. I wanted to ask you this. Today, nobody has illusions. Democracy cannot be exported with conflict, with war. So I want to ask you this also as a political man. How can we then defend and disseminate democracy today? Is there a role of NATO in this respect? I ask you this because NATO is not just about defense, but it does many more things.
The core purpose of NATO is to defend all allies. But NATO is also defending some values. And in our founding treaty, it is clearly stated that our core values are freedom, individual liberties, and the rule of law. And those core values are also the core values in any democratic society. And therefore, NATO is an alliance of 29 democracies. And by having a strong NATO, we're also defending our democratic open societies. And I absolutely agree with Minister Alfano that people have to be safe to be free. And we need freedom to have real democracy. So NATO is contributing to democracy partly by defending our own countries. But we are also helping, not by force, but through cooperation, through partnership, to also build democratic institutions in other countries. For instance, when we are working in Afghanistan, we are helping them with building government institutions, fighting corruption, and also defending those democratic institutions against violence from terrorist organizations and Taliban. And for instance, when NATO was very engaged in ending ethnic wars in the Balkans in the 1990s, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, close to Italy, in Serbia, in Kosovo, that was also about helping to create peace and the foundation for democracy. So NATO's task is to defend 29 democracies, close to 1 billion people living in democratic societies. But NATO's responsibility is also to work with neighbors, with partners around the world, to help them create free and democratic societies. That's good for them, but it's also good for us, because if we have stable, free, democratic neighbors, we are also more secure. And since I'm here in Rimini at this meeting, I will also underline that part of that is, of course, also the freedom of religion. Because when NATO's founding act speaks about individual liberties, that also, of course, includes the individual liberty, the freedom to worship the God you believe in. So NATO is an alliance for freedom, for democracy and for peace. Thank you.
Grazie. Nel salutarvi.
Thank you very much. Before saying goodbye, I want to say that you can support the meeting in several and multiple ways, also by donating. And I want to greet our Secretary of State of the Republic of San Marino. I say goodbye to our two guests. I thank them. Well, I don't know, Mr. Alfano, what are your next tasks? Because there's always a lot going on in Italy. But certainly, probably, we hope you will come next time as well. We hope Mr. Alfano will come and Mr. Stoltenberg. So you promised to come back to Rimini on holiday also. So if you come back to Rimini, you are always very welcome. And maybe you can stay more days for holiday.